right, ready to do this?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So, starting up now. Hey everyone, welcome to Lawyers Who Stream, episode 10, talking about diversity and inclusion today. We got with us Chris Diaz. Sorry, pronunciation last name, is it Diaz? Diaz?
It's funny. It's actually, I guess, I'm partially Portuguese, so it's apparently Dias, but it's my father's last name, and we grew up with him telling us it was Diaz. So I've just chosen to stick with it. So Diaz is good.
Diaz, perfect. So Chris Diaz has completed his articles now. Congratulations on Treaty 13 territory at a prominent litigation firm in Toronto, Ontario. Will be returning there as an associate in the fall now that he has been called to the bar. Congratulations again.
Thank
He's
you.
an access to justice advocate, having worked with organizations such as Pro Bono Students Canada, recipient of Osgoode Hall's Golden Key Award, and in his free time, Chris is a board game enthusiast. I am as well. An amateur photographer, and was chipping away at his travel bucket list in pre pandemic times. This summer, doing a lot of yoga and getting in some hiking before returning to work. Currently, he is on vacation. So, Chris, welcome to the show. Like I said, here to talk about diversity and inclusion in the profession. Now, just to position myself, I'm coming from this topic as a white person, as a Jewish person, as a queer person. I can speak to those experiences, clearly, but I don't feel that any of these identities have really led to my own personal marginalization within the profession. And I'm happy you came onto there because I feel like it's important for people like me to find people to talk to who have experienced that, because it's the only way for folks like me to learn. Um, and work together and try and find solutions. So I'm glad that you're here to tackle this topic, to start a conversation. And I'm going to go back to the beginning here, talk a little bit about Osgoode Hall Law School, that experience, what opportunities you had there, and how your experiences in law school shaped you into an access to justice advocate now in your career.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Teddy. I really appreciate it. Sort of in line with what you just said, and I know we talked about this a bit before, I'm definitely coming at this conversation from the position of my lived experience as well, too. So not only someone who's of a minority identity, not only someone who's queer as well, but also someone who's a new call, certainly 6 days old, but someone who's very new to the profession. And so I'm coming at it from sort of a different perspective as well, too. And so I'm glad that we're getting to have this conversation together.
Mm-hmm.
As far as my experience at Osgoode goes, so I started back, I guess, like 2017 at this point. And as far as like access to justice things would go, I was first drawn to, you go through the clinic programs in your first year. They do a big push to get applications out and make sure that students are interested.
Yeah, for sure.
Every student wants their experience. I ended up at CLASS, which is the Community Legal Aid Services program at Osgoode. It's an internal clinic to the school, but certainly helps the surrounding communities. And so I worked in the criminal law division there in my first year. So I guess first year summer throughout my second year and ending right before my 2L summer. And so my time in that role was very much devoted to, not only the things that law students want, so file work and getting to manage your own files, working with a lawyer, those are all great, but really getting to work with people going through issues that are unique to access to justice issues. So people who can't afford to obtain legal service elsewhere, people who don't necessarily have anywhere else to turn to in the community. So, I'd be going to local courthouses and appearing for them and things like that. And so those kind of experiences really ground you in the first year of law school, certainly very much in the height of your own experience. I feel like a lot of people are very, I'm not sure what the word is I want, but certainly you're focused a lot on just, you want to get by, you want to adjust, you want to make sure you're getting through law school as best you can. And so getting thrown into something like that is very eye-opening to realize, like, okay, as much as, you're a person going through law school, that in and of itself is a sense of coming from a privileged position, right? You're then interacting with people who don't have that kind of privilege, or having a completely different life experience, and it's really eye-opening to listen to them, to learn what they're going through, to speak on their behalf, to work with them on their case. Like it was a super transformative experience. The clinic director, who's still there now, Suzanne Johnson, she's like one of the best people I've ever met in terms of not only an educator, but also someone who's just like a fierce advocate. I can't say enough good things about her. I'm sure we could fill the whole hour with me talking about Suzanne Johnson, but that was very much my one experience. And then I guess sort of just lump 2L and 3L together. It was very, as you mentioned in my intro, PBSE heavy. So my Pro Bono Students Canada experience was very much volunteer based in my first year and my second year. And those were different sort of programs. In my first year, I helped, part of the reason I guess maybe I got into CLASP in my 1L summer was I helped launch an ID clinic through PBSE. And so helping people get IDs just for like access to necessary services, health cards, photo cards, something like that was really eye-opening to me as well too, because coming from, the background that I come from, where I grew up somewhat, middle class, upper middle class, you don't see things like people needing assistance to get ID to be able to access basic services like healthcare. Like stuff like that was also really transformative for me as well too. And so I took that experience into my CLASP life. And once I got out of CLASP, I realized, okay, well, I still want to do something like this to finish out my time at Osgoode, because I feel like there's still more to do. And so I ended up applying and successfully getting the position of the program coordinator at PBSE. So I got to run the full program of the Osgoode chapter at Osgoode in my last year, which was like one of the best experiences of my life. It really set me on this path of believing that even though I knew sort of the area of law I'd be going into, I'd be in more of a corporate setting. I knew that no matter where I was going to end up, it felt important to me to make sure I was doing pro bono work. Not only is it work that it's necessary, but it's work that's it's work that's never done. It's work that needs people like us who go into the profession to remember that still has to be, work that has to be done. And so, yeah, I mean, that might have been a longer answer than you're expecting, but that's sort of the full clip notes of it all.
No, for sure. I know that speaking personally and speaking for a lot of people at Windsor Law, those clinic programs, the pro bono programs, they really put you in touch with people who need legal services the most and yet are least able to access it. And, we talk about a whole lot of different identities when we talk about diversity and inclusion, but class is a huge one. Just the amount of wealth, the amount of privilege that people have access to based on where they were born, who their parents are, what their parents' jobs were. It can set you on this completely different footing in life. And before you even get to law school, like you said, we're already privileged coming into law school just to have this knowledge and be able to go. Taking you now to your current work at the firm. You work in a fairly large-sized firm. And just wanted to know if you want to talk a little bit about your experience there, what they did to, and this is all obviously in the context of the pandemic too, so you can talk a little bit about that, but what they did to make you feel welcome, whether you had any difficulties finding mentors there that maybe shared your life experience, and just how you sort of were, I guess, welcomed into that firm environment, and whether you had any challenges there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you mentioned, the pandemic, I think, was just a blanket challenge for everybody. And so we all did the best we can in that regard. I know throughout my time at my firm, I really credited them for doing everything they could to make sure that despite being separated, and talking through computers all the time, that we were included, that we felt like we were a part of the firm. We weren't just sort of these, external, extraneous people. So I know something that I really value that I mentioned a lot to people who came looking to apply to the same firm as well too, for example, was that it was the kind of environment where I could message someone or pop onto them on Zoom, on Microsoft Teams, and it wouldn't be a big deal. And I know at other firms that wouldn't necessarily be the case, where you couldn't just throw open Teams and maybe talk to a partner or call a partner or something. But a lot of people were really accommodating with their schedule and their time. And I throughout the 8 months that I had there, I really took advantage of scheduling these little chats and things like that with people across the firm in many different practice groups, just to make sure I was having not only for my own fulsome experience, but I really like the people who were there. The people were a large part of the reason why I applied to the firm. It's a large part of the reason why I chose to accept an offer to be an associate there. The work is going to be great, but if the environment is great too, it's going to promote longevity and sort of, this will relate to the diversity and inclusion stuff, of course, but if the environment is welcoming and it makes you feel like you belong there, then naturally the work's going to be better. The relationships are going to prosper. And that's really how I felt. Even in that 8 month span, I really felt like I was myself, as well as, I know my colleagues as well, who I article with, we really felt like we were being included as best we could in pandemic times. And I know every firm handled that differently, but I really felt like my firm did a good job with that.
So what sort of steps did they take to make sure that you were included? And also, while you're talking about that, was there sort of a culture there that you identified? Throughout your time.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, I know it's in the bio and everything, so I think I can just say it. But I work at Lerners, and so my first exposure to them actually was way back in first year. And the reason I mention this is because I remember meeting a Lerners lawyer at our Osgoode O Week like, first week of school, we had, I think, a pub event or something. And honestly, the only lawyer who stood from that experience for me was someone from Lerners. And it was just because I could feel there was a different sort of tone and personality there. And then Lerners also happens to sponsor a moot at Osgoode during our first year called the Lerners Cup. And so I got to see and meet a lot of the same people as well too. And so that put in my mind already from way back then that it was a different kind of place. They hired the right kind of people. They were really welcoming, warm kind of people. And so I kept that thread all the way through articling. And so when it came time to apply for articling, they were one of the places I really wanted to go. Like it was easy to call back on those memories and remember those kind of people. And through the interview process and all that, I really felt like that culture was true. It wasn't just something I'd seen in front of me because they were doing some Osgoode event. It was something that I continuously encountered. So as far as culture goes, that was that. In terms of specific things for articling, not only like the availability of it all, but also the firm itself in our articling program, they had scheduled time for us as well too. So I know everyone goes through this when they're in a workplace, like law or otherwise. You go to a new workplace, you don't know anybody. It's hard to sort of figure out where do you fit in, how do you meet people. And so I really appreciate that the firm took the time to schedule training sessions or things with certain lawyers and certain and practice groups that, they got to talk to you about their expertise. And then you had an opening to sort of message them afterwards and be like, it was really amazing to learn from you about this thing. Could we talk more about this maybe? Or it'd be great to have a chat with you sometime soon. I really resonated with something you talked about, right? And so that culture sort of transcended all of these training sessions, and they allowed us the space to be able to connect with these lawyers as well too. And we had, of course, like events and things like that as well too. We had stuff at the end of our time in December before our winter break, and then we had stuff towards the end of our term in May as well too. Like there were just a lot of opportunities to get to know people outside of the law. And I think that's super important. It's great to see all these lawyers you look up to and these partners and these amazing advocates in their element, right? Like watching them do discovery, watching them do a trial, like that's all fantastic. But seeing sort of like the personable side of people as well too, getting to talk to them about their life, getting to talk to people about their kids, their pets, their hobbies, that kind of stuff really makes an impression with us.
Great. Did you feel that among the people you met there, it was like fairly representative of the bar in general in Ontario? Did you find that there was sort of diversity of life experiences they were able to learn from? Someone who you connected with in particular, like for example, that lawyer that you said stood out to you at that event. Like, what was it about them that really got you to bond with them?
Yeah, I think for me, it was that they were willing to be personable up front. Like there wasn't necessarily like a lawyer facade that I know, like, we talk a lot about in any industry, there's a certain level of professionalism you want to have, right? And I think sometimes that can get construed with not being personable. And I personally, as someone who, I certainly think I have some personality, I like to mix the two. Like, you can be professional and be personable at the same time. And so, yes, actually that specific person was a thread I picked back up on when I started articling. They're one of the first people I reached out to be like, hey, hello, how are you doing? But also like, I let them know, like part of the reason I'm even here is because I remember that conversation with you all the way back. And that had such an impact on me that I sort of kept this firm in the back of my mind all the way through law school. And so it was really helpful to have that sort of anchor of an experience to come off of. And so that was one of the people who I checked in with monthly, if I'm not mistaken, on just like casual chats. Yes, about work, but also just again about life. And it was a really, really grounding experience to have sort of a constant throughout my articling term. And it was good to have like not just like an ally, but a friend within the firm as well too, someone to talk to, someone to discuss work and really just, and working in the pandemic as well too, because just like we're going through it, all the lawyers for the most part are home as well too. And so it's nice to share in that experience. It's something that you can sort of bond over when you're all going through the same thing. Like the pandemic's obviously been bad for so many reasons, but it was a little bit of an equalizer in the sense that we all had to be sitting at home working from the screen. And so it gave it an in to be able to talk to these lawyers about that and see how they were doing versus other people, versus how you're doing, and just being able to have those conversations together.
So you mentioned that you're on plaintiff side, personal injury, in your own practice, but you're
Mhm.
also the learners are being very supportive to support your pro bono work and also do some diversity and inclusion initiatives while you're there too. Do you want to talk a little bit about those initiatives, the diversity and inclusion initiatives, how they're taking shape, what your future plans are? Is any of that sort of being planned out?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about what was done because I think something I really credit my firm with was that I was able to participate in that space even as an articling student. I know that was very important to me as well, as I didn't want to necessarily work somewhere where I couldn't use my voice in that way, if that makes sense. I
Right.
wanted to make sure that even as a student, like we all had something to say, right? Like I think just like we acknowledged at the top of this broadcast that we both come from different experiences and those add value to a conversation. I think it's really important that firms recognize that that's true of every level of person as well too, from your articling students to your clerks. Like everyone has something to say, and it adds value to the overall conversation. So for me specifically, the one that stands out is that I got to work on our Asian Heritage Month campaign,
Hmm.
and we have subcommittees for each of the different the initiatives that the committee takes on. And I personally, and I know this was sort of like well publicized on Twitter, but the thing that stood out to me was that the students between we have a articling cohort in Toronto and London as well too, and so there's several students between the two. Between those two groups, there were four of us who are of Asian descent, and so we got together and talked about like what can we do for this month, like what can we do that really feels like we're having an impact and we're sort of putting something out there for everyone to read, for allies to read and acknowledge, but also for people who look at us to read and feel like they can connect to.
Hmm.
And we ended up coming up with a blog series, and so we got to write our personal experience in this 4-part blog series, so one for every week of the month of May, and talk about just straight up our lived experience. And they were all very different. The firm did not edit them. They were very, respectful of our experience. They acknowledged that we came from a place of something, things that would happen to us in our past, or things that we had gone through, or things that didn't happen to us that possibly should have. And we were able to put that in words on the page and get them out there. And that's why everyone got to read what I thought was like something I was really proud of. I'm really glad the four of us were able to come together and put something like that together that might not have flown at perhaps a different firm. I think it was really important that we were truthful and honest, and also came from a place of like education as opposed to any other perspective, because ultimately a lot of this diversity inclusion discussion is about the education piece of it, and that's what the four of us felt very strongly about. So that's what we put out into the world. We were grateful that the firm gave us the platform to do that.
Do you feel that's typical of the firm to include the articling students deliberately in what they're trying to do, sort of the public facing work?
I mean, based on my experience, I feel pretty confident in saying yes. I think if you were to extrapolate out to the profession as a whole, though, I think this is one of the things that is good to talk about when we talk about inclusion of voices, right? So obviously at the end of the day, you're an articling student, you're hired to do a job. And I think it's important that we remember that. It's yes, you're hired to listen, to learn, to interact with your mentors, to absorb as much information as you can, to put out work product, to sort of join this wonderful, beautiful machine that's been working for so many years. And that's great. I think the idea of including students in other things going on in the firm, different firms do that to different degrees. I mean, I can certainly speak very positively from my own experience, but I had friends at other firms that maybe didn't have as high of an experience for different reasons, right?
Hmm.
And, I certainly learned in the 8 months of my articling what a privilege it was to even have the option to do those things versus some of my friends who didn't necessarily have those options and wanted to be able to lend their voices to something, right? So it's even now in 2020, 2021, it was it's still interesting to see the difference in approach to that, and sort of what level people do include their students.
So that actually segues nicely into my last point. So, in your opinion, what can the Law Society, senior partners at other firms, these sort of leaders in the profession that we all look up to, what can they do to further diversify the profession, bring in more voices, and make sure that people are receiving support?
I think, I mean, there's definitely several things.
And I realize that's a huge question, so take your time answering it, and we can
Yeah, for sure.
get into it.
I've given this some thought. I mean, certainly something that I've done, and I know people of all walks of life coming out of law school have done as well too. Is we not only do we talk to people at these different firms, but we go to your websites. We see what's being promoted, we see what's there, we see what's not there, which is also important because we recognize those things, and so we're able to form certain opinions based on that information, right?
Right.
And so I think in doing that, some of the things that I've realized are that we're certainly doing okay in a number of, I guess, to put it simply, metrics, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a lot of programming, for example, around women right now, and I think that's obviously fantastic. I think one thing I might, challenge people to consider is how broad is that spectrum, right? Is it just a certain demographic of women? I do know there, some firms, in looking at the different information on different websites,
Hmm.
especially ones that publish statistics, they tend to lump um, all women together, and so you don't really get the numbers of how many diverse women are there. And I know that's already a huge talking point amongst the legal profession, especially in Toronto right now. And so I don't think it's controversial for me to say that. I think it's a known thing that we're all talking about.
Yeah.
And certainly something else that I've been thinking a lot about is whether or not it's important for firms to have someone dedicated in that role. And I think the answer is probably yes. You can see
Dedicated to
what
the role of diversity and inclusion, you mean?
yeah, in some capacity. I mean, certainly different firms do it differently. Some have specialists, some have, proper officers, and every firm has their own approach, their own budget. So I think it's internal to the firm to figure out what makes sense for them. But certainly it does say something when you have like a dedicated person whose job every day is to come in and think about diversity and inclusion, and who not only that, but also that person is mindful of different communities, different groups, different needs outside of just because I think that the trend in the profession right now is to target a lot of the programming based on what month we're celebrating. So we're in Pride right now,
Hmm.
Pride Month, but we're also in Indigenous History Month as well too, right? And so it's great to have programming now, and you're representing with that awesome visual behind you. That's great. And last month we did Asian Heritage Month, like I just said,
Yeah.
and obviously Black History Month in February is big as well too. But what kind of programming can be done year round to represent, recognize, and give voice to those groups?
Totally.
And it's a big challenge. I mean, I've already talked to a few senior lawyers like far ahead of me in the profession who've been doing this for several years, and a common thing I've already heard is like, is this not asking a lot of people? And I think
Mm.
there's some truth to that because it is, in a sense, a lot all at once. I think my counter at the same time would be it feels like a lot at the same time because there was a lot not necessarily being done for a long time. And so now you're getting people who are being louder about certain groups, wanting to be more represented. You're getting our generation coming in saying, this is what we're looking for if you're going to employ us, right?
Hmm.
And so I think all of those things are very important. So yeah, I think those are the main things to go back to the first thing I said, I think reporting statistics, regardless of what the demographics of your firm is,
Yeah.
are super important. Like, um, I think even if they are negative, or not negative, but even if they look a certain way, I think the idea is you're not publishing them to show off necessarily. You're publishing them for accountability, right? And
Totally.
if it's a space that believes in diversity and inclusion, you'll publish them however they are, and then as you republish them every year, 5 years, whatever your timeline is, you're showing that growth, right? That's your commitment, your public commitment to showing that growth. I think even if firms don't want to necessarily publish that right away, I think it's really important that firms have their own diversity data on hand. So knowing the demographics of their own firm,
Yeah.
because if you can see it yourself, even if it's not public, it does, hopefully, the hope is it does inform
Mhm.
what your programming is year round, right? It's not necessarily a thing you're going to do by month as we celebrate.
Yeah. So a few points there. First of all, getting a yes from the chat. Thank you for being brave enough to say. Just to summarize your point there, maybe lack of intersectionality in listing women at a firm. Not drilling down any further into what demographic of women are at a firm. Taking more detailed statistics, I think you said, is also super important. Um, I think there was. I may be wrong about this, but I seem to remember earlier this year or last year there were there were a few firms who were publishing statistics on how many racialized lawyers were at their firm, but there were also noted absences on that list of firms that published. You know, people calling out this or that firm that chose not to publish. You're absolutely right that it does benefit the firm, even if they don't make it public, to collect that data for themselves so they have something to work with, because being in ignorance of it just doesn't help anyone. Um, Comment from the chat: Sunshine List, one of the main reasons that mag lawyers have better wage parity because it's public data about pay scale. That's true. I think that salary, lack of transparency in salary, both in the hiring process, because there's a lot of issues with that, and also knowing how much money associates and partners make at certain firms is also something that can be fixed. Because yeah, like you said, you look at combining those two things, you know, statistics on demographics and also statistics on salaries, I think can go a long way to addressing the really deep inequality in this profession. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning all that. I think that's great. We've got a few minutes left, but so just going to open it up here, wondering if you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with.
Yeah, I think something else that I wanted to mention that not that it doesn't get enough focus, but certainly there are larger parts of the diversity inclusion conversation
Mm-hmm.
that do get a lot of attention. Something I'm particularly interested in is what allyship looks like.
Mm.
Um, and actually, in the blog post I mentioned earlier that I did for my firm for Asian Heritage Month, it was about some personal stories in my life, but I sort of ended it with this. There was a quote that I know a lot of people on Twitter really, I guess they resonated with them, and so they quoted it back when they were sharing the article. But it was something to the effect of like, I was talking about non-performative versus performative allyship, and it went something like, you know, every time you include someone in a room full of people who don't look like you, or like, you know, you include that person in a room where they don't look like everybody in that room, like you end up doing them a service, right? Like it's meant to, like that's what allyship looks like, right? It's not just necessarily sharing the right things and donating to the right causes. Those are all great things.
Yeah.
And I've had several conversations with friends where like that's the extent of what they can do, and I think that's completely fine. Everyone has their own part to do in this, but certainly if you are able to and have the privilege and can include people in those rooms, in those conversations, in those associations, wherever it is, that's what real allyship looks like. And I know certainly that's, you know, if you would ask me what maybe the next 5 years look like for me in terms of diversity and inclusion work, I think it's something in that realm, because
Mm.
I so many places are doing, and you know, you can see the progress, and I do want to commend. There's obviously certain firms who are doing certain things really well,
Yeah, for sure.
you know, and I think that's great, and those specific places should definitely be lauded for that. In terms of where the profession is going, they're going to continue to do those same things, and that's wonderful, and represent certain communities and give them more exposure, and that's great. I think allyship is a huge part of it, because you do at the end of the day have to mobilize people who don't fit into those groups to be able to actually give time and energy and support and whatever
Mm-hmm.
into those groups as well too. So I know, like, just off the top of my head, when we're talking about what firms can do with your previous question, I think of like the year-round programming. I think allyship programming is actually probably something that should be everywhere, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever form that takes, I mean, again, that's up to the individual firms to decide, but I think it would be great if firms had something that was reoccurring throughout the year, that was much more focused, less on, you know, there's a time and a place for the education piece, but certainly I think there's also a time and a place to instead take the angle of like, how can you as an ally of these communities, you know, do something, say something, be something in, you know, in support of that community. I don't know if we necessarily do enough of that as an entire profession, and I think it would be wonderful if we did do a bit more of that.
I'm glad you brought it back to the year-end programming, because there's a point I wanted to make that I had forgotten about, but I'll make it now. So I'm on the board for Sojik, which is I think, yep, it's up in the corner there, and the Pride logo that got behind me. They're responsible for that, so shout out to them.
Mm-hmm.
But they do year-round programming on queer issues in the law specifically. We had not just during Pride Month is kind of our biggest month for that, but specifically last year, we had a great program on elder law put together with elder law to address queer issues. We publish articles throughout the year. We keep an eye on these things and have monthly meetings. So I think that, speaking totally just for myself here, like resourcing groups from other equity seeking communities through organizations like the OBA, through the Advocate Society, to
Mhm.
create these programmings and actually, properly, like I said, just give them the resources and the know how to do so, I think would really go a long way. And maybe that's something we should start having conversation about outside of just Sojik. Um,
Absolutely. I
question
think that's a
from,
great example.
yeah. Question from Tom in the chat. Do you think earlier in legal careers, i.e., during OCIs, there could be a greater role for diversity and inclusion in that process?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, in the sense that, I mean, look, in an ideal world, if every firm didn't have like a dedicated person for D&I at the firm who could be involved, because there's something to be said about D&I being involved in the hiring process too, right? Because if the entire hiring panel possibly looks a certain way, that sends a message to the students you're trying to hire. And I think that's really important that that's reflective in your hiring practices. But I think if there's not going to be a dedicated person like a diversity and inclusion officer or whatever, I know there are companies out there. There are groups of people that do this stuff. Like in the little I've been able to see of it, I know they exist. So if firms would bring on like a diversity and inclusion specialist and really involve them in hiring time, at least hire them for that period of time, I think that would be great to sort of reform your hiring practices, have somebody involved actively throughout the process that can contribute to the conversations around who to hire.
Hmm.
Because this goes back to allyship, but part of the reason why I feel so strongly about allyship is that a lot of the times people just don't recognize either their own bias or their own privilege, and it's often not a negative thing. It's just like and we talked about this at the top of the show about coming into law school, and that's a privilege, right? Like you don't recognize it until you're confronted with it, right? That's often the case, and so if firms can have someone to be there in the middle of second round interviews, third round, whatever, and be like, okay, like have someone in the room to contribute to that conversation, to be like, okay, have we considered this angle? Have we considered this angle? Are these students being treated all equally in this way? Just to have someone to sort of coach them through it, because firms are obviously well equipped at hiring. They all have, deep benches of fantastic lawyers. Like there's no surprise there, but the point is to have fantastic lawyers who all look different, right? And so having someone who specializes in that is probably not a bad idea, whether internal to the firm or external who's there for a temporary time. I think those can only benefit the hiring practices at each firm.
For sure. And with that bit of great advice, I think we'll wrap up. A few things to plug that I want to plug just at the bottom of the show here. First of all, shout out to Lerners for promoting the show. I really appreciate it, and for
Mhm.
letting one of their Arctic students come on to talk about this. Sorry, associate now. I shouldn't call you an Arctic student anymore. Congratulations on getting called to the bar.
Appreciate
A
that.
few things I want to mention here. First of all, Doron Gold coming back next week. We're going to talk about mental health and get that in after some technical difficulties derailed the stream last week. That's all fixed now, so we're good. Want to plug another event happening on the 14th as well. Sojik and the LSO putting on an event together, a discussion on queer and BIPOC identities in law. It's going to be an awesome panel. Margaret Froh, president of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Justice Andrew Pinto is going to be there. Nirji Damali Sojourner Campbell from Hicks Morley, and Samantha Peters will also be on the panel, moderated by Gregory Coe of Castner Lamb. Going to be a great program. Really looking forward to it. It's our joint LSO event that we put on every year. And finally, there's going to be another event on Twitter Spaces that just started a couple of minutes ago. Friends of the show, Jen Philpott and Gurteg Singh, trying something a little new there. I'm probably going to roll over to that right after we wrap up here. So,
Mhm.
yeah, check them out. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for coming on. This was a really great conversation. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. Would love to come back.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.